Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon.
My name is Eleanor, and I'd like to give you a really warm welcome to Big Questions. Thank you for coming along today. The aim of Big Questions is to provide a forum in which we can investigate and discuss relevant and important topics about life and meaning and the Christian faith. And today, Jonny Dyer is going to come and help us think through the question, blind faith, is Christianity just a product of culture? So am I just a Christian because my parents are Christians? He'll be giving us a short talk, and then there'll be time for some discussion around tables and a question time after that. Jonny studied engineering as an undergrad and has 2 master's level theology degrees. Then he practiced law for 10 years, and he now works for a church in central London, working with undergraduate and postgraduate students. Do feel free to text in your questions throughout the talk. The number you need is on the stand here and in the pillars around, or when it comes to question time, feel free just to stick up your hand and there'll be a mic coming round. Before we start, I'm just going to read out a little bit of the Bible to you that's going to be helpful for us during the talk that Jonny will reference. So it's from the book of Acts, and it says this. As soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. Great. I'd like to invite Jonny up to talk to us now.
Thank you, Eleanor. Yes, as Eleanor said, our big question this lunchtime is, blind faith, is Christianity just a product of culture? It's interesting, actually. I work with students in central London, and I'm finding that this question is asked more and more. Or it is just assumed. It is assumed because we were born in a Christian country, or we grew up in a Christian home, that is the reason that we are a Christian. In sort of much the same way that if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you would be a Muslim. Or if you were born in India, you would be a Hindu. And that may be the assumption that you have this lunchtime regarding your own Christian friends. Deep down, you think that they're a Christian because they were born in a Christian home. Now, when someone asks me that question, is Christianity just a product of culture? My gut instinct is to want to ask them this question back. Is your belief that my faith is just the result of social conditioning, the result of your own social conditioning, the result of your own culture? Is your belief about Christians just a product of your own environment, circumstances, situation? Now, there can be 2 answers to that question. Either yes, you can acknowledge, yes, my belief about you as a Christian has been shaped by my own culture. Or the answer is no. I've come to that opinion quite independently of my own cultural background. Now, if the answer to that question is yes, then I want to press them a little bit deeper. I want to say, is your socially conditioned belief valid? If it is valid, then I think it is reasonable to deduce that it's actually okay to have a socially conditioned belief. If the person, rather than acknowledges that their belief is socially conditioned, they say, no, actually my belief isn't, then inadvertently they have undermined their own argument by indicating that there's no validity to their own question. Now, if in answer to the question, is your belief that my faith is just a result of social conditioning, the result of your own social conditioning? If the answer to that is no, I've arrived at my own conclusion about you quite independently of the social background that I come from. In that case, it is surely possible to reach a belief about something without being socially conditioned. Now, do you see the point here? It is either perfectly acceptable to have a socially conditioned belief, to be a Christian, or it is perfectly possible to reach a belief in Christianity outside of your social condition. So let's have a closer look at our question. Blind faith. Is Christianity just a product of culture, of social conditioning? Well, largely, yes, it is. Christianity is just a product of culture. At least the kind of Christianity that the media portrays, or that many of us brushed up against in our school assemblies, or the kind of belief that's associated with state religion, the Church of England. This idea that the UK is a Christian country. This actually was the claim of David Cameron over Easter. I don't know if you saw his Easter message. He was talking about the courage and the kindness of society, and he said these words: "At the heart of all these acts of kindness and courage is a set of values and beliefs that have been helped to make our country what it is today. Values of responsibility, hard work, charity, compassion, and pride in working for the common good and honouring the social obligations we have to one another, to our families, and to our communities. These are values we treasure. They are Christian values, and they should give us the confidence to say, yes, we are a Christian country and we are proud of it." So I want to recognize in the first instance that there is credibility to the assertion that Christianity is just a product of our culture, particularly Cameron's Christianity. I mean, how else do we explain the decreasing number of professing Christians in the West as the culture moves away from its Christian heritage? It would seem that nominal Christianity is dying. It's true also, I understand, with Singapore and also with Hong Kong. And the same could also be said of America. Now, I have here a cartoon to illustrate what I think is going on. So, looking on the left, you'll see there's a guy saying, "I am definitely not a Christian." The guy on the right is saying, "I am definitely a Christian." The chap in the middle is saying, "I honestly don't care that much about following Jesus, but it's socially advantageous for me to self-identify as a Christian. So that's what I do." That was America 20 years ago. America today, the guy on the left is still saying, "I am definitely not a Christian." The guy on the right, "I am definitely a Christian." Whereas the guy on the middle is now saying, "Okay, so times have changed and it's no longer socially advantageous for me to self-identify as a Christian. So I've stopped. I'm on this side now." The guy's saying, "Dang, Christian, research says you're dying over there. There used to be two of you and now there's only one. You should be worried." Nah, there was really only one of us before, and there's still only one of me. The other guy is just being more honest. And oddly enough, I feel healthier than I have for a long time. You know, yes, there are many people who say, I grew up in a Christian country, I grew up in a Christian home, therefore I am a Christian. But less so. You know, to be a Christian in England today is to be increasingly marginalized. You know, I do wonder if there's a tendency now, not so much to sort of go with the flow of being a Christian as in time past, but now to sort of go with the flow of being an agnostic or an atheist. You know, it's sort of easier to do that and to do that almost without thinking, just accept, well, I'm an atheist, because society sort of reflects that attitude. I don't know what you think. So having drawn this important distinction between what would be a cultural label, if you like, and a heart belief, Christianity is a heart belief, I want us to look more closely at our original question by slightly reshaping it. I want us to ask, is real life changing Christianity just a product of culture? Is true Christianity just a product of culture? Well, yes, again, almost certainly. Now, I grew up in a Christian home, and it was, on the whole, a very positive experience. It was a loving home. They gave me a strong moral foundation, a social conscience. They prepared me to engage in the world, to thrive in the workplace and in relationships. They were good parents. And you could very easily argue that I was socially conditioned into believing. But does that make the faith that I came to believe wrong? Just because it happened to be the same faith as my mum and dad? I want you to think about this. Even if Christian faith is the result of social conditioning, that does not imply that this faith is false. To claim this false implication is a genetic fallacy. And this fallacy is to avoid the argument by shifting focus onto someone's origins. Now, did you notice how Boris Johnson did that last week with Obama? Obama was here, and he was making the case for the United Kingdom to stay in Europe. And Boris Johnson wrote a piece in the Telegraph, and what he deflected, or sought to deflect people from the arguments by picking up on the fact that Obama was from Kenya. So, to argue that the credibility of mine, or indeed anyone's belief in Christianity, should be dismissed just because we grew up in a Christian home is to ignore that there may be other credible arguments for Christianity. Now, at the same time, to concede that faith is a product of what mum and dad taught me does not imply that faith is exclusively down to them, just an important component. And this is supported, isn't it? I mean, there will be those of us here who are from Christian homes. We have acknowledged that Jesus and the Christianity is true, but we will have siblings, we'll have brothers, sisters, who have no interest whatsoever. I was in contact with a good friend just this past week, and he was saying to me that he'd grown up in a nominal Christian home, and his parents had just taught him that Christianity was just a comforting philosophy. And then during his teenage years, he himself began to investigate the claims of Christianity, and he came to the conclusion that it was historically true. And now he is a Christian, and his brother remains a nominal believer. You see, the main point here is that if there is solid argument, solid evidence for Christianity, it cannot be refuted on the basis of social conditioning. Rather, we have to examine the evidence and ask, is there evidence for Christianity that transcends culture? So I want us to ask, secondly, is there evidence that true Christianity transcends culture? Now, there are actually endless examples throughout history of true Christians holding views that are at odds with culture, of being countercultural. It's true in the church in China today. I was there a few years back, and it is true. They say, and it is the case, that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese coming to believe in Jesus every month. It's estimated by 2030 that there will be more Christians in China than there will be in America. It's also true for those early believers, those early Christians after the death of Jesus. Their faith was at odds with the culture. Now, Christianity, as you may well know, it began in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, and it spread up through modern-day Turkey to Rome, and it spread through the Jewish population who, through the diaspora, had spread out the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, had given them the freedom to move, the movement of population, and Jews had located in all the key cities in Europe, modern-day Europe. And when the missionaries left the Middle East, they went, first and foremost, to the synagogue where these Jews were, and they preached to them. And you have to understand that Judaism of that day was very much like the strict monotheism of Islam today. It was extremely resistant to the idea of what these missionaries were preaching, and that is that Jesus was not only a man, but he was the Son of God. And so wherever these missionaries went and they preached to the Jews, they received a really hostile reaction. Let me read to you an account here of one of these missionaries, what happened to him. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. It was always a surprise when one of these missionaries arrived in one of these cities and found Jews who were receptive, who were willing to engage with this idea that Jesus was divine, that he was a God. And we actually find an example of this in a place called Berea. It was the reading that Eleanor read to us. And Berea it was located in Macedonia, that's northern Greece. And they're an example of Jewish people who were countercultural because they were willing to look at the evidence for themselves, to make their own investigations. And what we saw from that reading is that many believed, and that was against the culture. Now let's just have a look. I'd like to look at this passage before us, and I want just to highlight a few things about it that enables us to draw the conclusion that Christianity transcends culture. And the first thing to see, you'll notice there that Paul and Silas, they escaped at night. And the reason they escaped from night from Thessalonica is because the Jews basically had gathered a mob together and they were marching around Thessalonica and they wanted to kill these 2 missionaries. And so they had to escape by night. And that, I guess, is the normal reaction that you would have expected when these missionaries were preaching about Jesus. But you'll notice there that the Berean Jews, it says, now the Berean Jews were more noble more noble of character than those in Thessalonica. For they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. As a result, many of them believed. So these Berean Jews, against the culture, they listened to the teaching of Paul the missionary, and then they went away and took that teaching and compared it with the Old Testament scriptures, the Old Testament Bible. They did their own research. And against the culture, they acknowledged that Jesus indeed was divine. It's countercultural. And we see that many of them believed. Now, if that was countercultural, we read on and we see that also prominent Greek women and many Greek men came to believe too. Now, a word about blind faith. Blind faith, it's an accusation often thrust upon Christians that they have faith instead of reason. It's sort of often suggested in a sort of disparaging sort of way. Christians, they're a little bit simple. Instead of relying on logic and reason to understand the world, they accept everything as it is at face value, sort of blind faith. It was Mark Twain who once defined faith as this: believing what you know ain't true. And this, though, is not what the Bible means when it uses the word faith. Not at all. The Bible does not promote a belief in the irrational or any type of unwarranted blind faith. Rather, the Bible encourages us to examine faith, to look at the evidence, to use our reason. Does faith contradict reason? I would suggest that faith doesn't do that, but that faith is often the conclusion of reason. Faith is, as the Bible says elsewhere, reasoned confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And we read here that the Bereans were of more noble character, or fair-minded, if you like, than those Jews in Thessalonica. And the reason is because they were willing to consider the evidence. They were open to the arguments. They had an intellectual openness to what Paul was teaching, the missionary. They had a freer thought and were willing to hear reason and acknowledge, if it made sense, to admit to the force of it. So what we see here is that the Bereans did not accept truth claims blindly. Rather, they listened carefully to Paul's reasons and examined them against the Old Testament scripture. They were testing the ideas of what Paul was saying, that Jesus in some way was divine, and they were comparing that with what the Old Testament said about the Messiah, who he would be and what he would do. And I guess the question this week, this lunchtime is, would you be like the Bereans? Would you be of noble character? Would you be willing to listen and to engage with the evidence that Christianity presents? I suggest to you that the faith of the Bereans, which was countercultural, and for that matter, the faith of the Chinese, which is equally so, and many others throughout the centuries, this is evidence that Christianity is more than just a product of culture. Rather, Christianity transcends culture. And is why Christianity is a worldwide, culturally independent religion. Now let me finally ask, what other evidence is there that Christianity transcends culture? Is there further evidence that true Christianity transcends culture? You see, as humans, we are only willing to make a real sacrifice for something that we see is greater than us, that transcends us, that is more important than us. Something that is bigger than our life. We're only willing to make a sacrifice for a greater good that we believe is more important than us. More important than reputation, more important than success, even more important than relationships. And in his teaching to the Bereans, Paul explained what this greater good was. It's God, the creator of the universe, the one who established the moral order in the universe, so that there is right from wrong, good from evil, and the one who ultimately raised Jesus from the dead. And as we know, that account that I read to you earlier was actually a description by Paul, the apostle. He was clearly willing to suffer for this belief, for this greater good. And the same is true of the disciples. Every single one of those disciples, according to history, was flogged, was beaten. They were treated as outcasts. History records and seems to suggest that many, if not all of them, bar one, were martyred for their faith, finally. And the one who we know was not martyred was John, and he was sent to exile in the Isle of Patmos. But not only Paul the apostle, not only the disciples, throughout history, Christians have been willing to be martyred for their faith. Even this past few years in the Middle East, many Christians have died for their faith in Christianity, in Jesus. And I think it is worth asking this question as we finish. Why were the disciples fearless? Well, surely it is because they had met Jesus, they'd known Jesus, they'd eaten lunch with Jesus. They had seen the fact that he had died. And then 3 days later, they had seen that he had conquered man's greatest enemy, and he had risen from the dead. And that had given them a new confidence in death, that death itself is just to be with Jesus. And so they had a confidence in the face of all the onslaught, all the criticism, whatever was thrown at them, that actually at the end of the day, death could not touch them. Is Christianity a product of culture? Well, yes, largely it is. But does it invalidate it? No, I would say, because there is evidence for it that transcends culture. Thank you.
In about 3 minutes, we'll be up again to answer some questions. Do keep texting in your questions as you discuss. Thanks.
I do actually have a couple of questions you might want to talk about. The first one is, what is the difference between nominal Christianity and Christianity as a heart belief? And the second one is, what evidence supports the resurrection of Christ, and what are the implications of it if it is true?
Great, thanks guys. If I could cut in there and bring us back together. So now we've got some time for questions. We've had a couple texted in, but if anyone has a question from the floor, feel free just to stick your hand up, and someone will come around with the roving mic. So first of all, are there any from the floor? Okay, great. Let's go for one from the text. So culture influences the interpretation of religious texts and therefore religion. 50 years ago, the church was opposed to homosexuality. Now there are pockets of contention, or consider belief in evolution or the doctrine of the Trinity imposed on the church in 400 AD. Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line of that malleability or permeability to culture? On the other hand, Jews who believe that Jesus contravened the rules that God laid down in the New Testament still believe that today. Shouldn't our belief in the truth be as unwavering as that?
Read that second bit again. That is a question. Who wrote that question?
It's quite long. So until now, there are Jews who believe that Jesus contravened the rules God laid down in the New Testament. Shouldn't our belief in the truth be as unwavering as that? Does that make sense?
And the first part was...
Sorry, so where do you draw the line between the malleability and permeability of culture influencing how our religion works out?
Yeah, okay. I think we have to acknowledge that Christianity has been influenced by culture, but also that Christianity has impacted culture. And it's actually quite difficult to disentangle the two. And I mean, one of the sadnesses, I think, if you look back in church history, is where Christianity has blended with culture, and we see there that it is terrible things have happened. So you think of the Crusades, and where Christianity wasn't true to itself, and it didn't transcend culture. And I think we just have to step back and acknowledge that there are some truths that are countercultural, not least in the way that we respond to them. So I think about the church, for example, the true church. When you actually get to understand it, it is thoroughly and utterly countercultural. So if you go back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, what we found there is that there were lots of plagues in some of the major cities in what is now modern-day Europe. And Christians, they were the only people who stayed. All the aristocracy and the wealthy and so forth, they left the cities. And it was the Christians who stayed to care for the people who were suffering, who had the plague. And so I think the only way that you can really measure the line, as it were, between Christianity that is integrated within culture and Christianity that is transcendent is the people who believe the kind of transcendent bits. For example, the fact that Jesus was resurrected, the fact that he died on the cross, it reflects in the way in which they live their lives. And so it is a fine line. I think that at times it is difficult, but you look back and you see that, it's in the manner and way in which they live their lives. What was the second part?
So some Jewish people up till now believe that Jesus contravened God's rules in the New Testament. Shouldn't our faith be as immovable as that?
Well, I think in a sense it is. I mean, the point is, though, is that we have come to believe the resurrection. It's very interesting, because I think it comes down to this question about the resurrection. It comes down to evidence. So, for example, 100 or so years ago, people used to talk about how did the myth of the resurrection come about? And it was something like this. It was that one person spoke to another person, they spoke to another person, that person spoke to another person. It was sort of like Chinese whispers. And what developed was the myth of the resurrection. And it was called a kind of progressive thesis, and this idea that something had developed. And so that whole idea has been turned on its head now. And so in the last 20 or so years, even hardened atheistic scholars have recognized the credibility of a particular text in 1 Corinthians 15. And that text basically it's an old creed, and it's been dated to just after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And in that text, it witnesses and describes the number of Christians who saw Jesus once he had been resurrected. And it's not only individuals, but it's groups of individuals, different times, different places. And these people witnessed this man who was supposedly resurrected. And so even atheistic scholars will acknowledge the credibility of this document. And it's completely, in a sense, been a bit of a game changer. I mean, it's interesting in there, it talks in the text, it says something like this. Many of whom are still alive, although some have dead. And it's sort of inviting people to sort of go, who are reading this text, go and speak to the people who actually saw Jesus alive. Now, that begs the question, first of all, how do you give account for all these people who saw the resurrected Jesus? But secondly, if there was a death-killing moment to Christianity, when was that? That would have been at the death of Jesus. But rather than Christianity die, it exploded. So this begs the question, how do you explain the resurrection of Jesus? Well, you have to look at the fact that people gave account, they saw Jesus, the church exploded. I mean, it's a remarkable thing that Jews are saying, Jesus is the Son of God, unfathomable. Jews are now worshipping on a Sunday rather than a Saturday, unfathomable. And so it's the evidence for the resurrection at the end of the day which is compelling. And I think it always comes back to that.
Brilliant, thank you.